This year, the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States on May 8th held a hearing regarding what is called anomalous health incidences, or what is known as Havana syndrome.
There are many examples of syndromes and ailments from Americans injured in the line of duty that the government did not recognize. Agent Orange used in Vietnam, the Gulf War syndrome, burn pits during the forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. Havana syndrome is no different. The gaslighting of AHI survivors continues to this day as history repeats itself.
Aaron Alexis ended up killing 16 people at the Navy Yard on the East Coast. And in the butt of his rifle, he wrote, "This is my ELF weapon, extremely low frequency." This is the smoking gun that we've been waiting for. This was a document that was only meant for high-level management in the Department of Corrections. Essentially, the implants make the unsurprising prisoner a walking, talking recorder of every event he comes into contact with.
I want you to lean to your right just a little bit. Upward.
What led you down the path of researching and investigating covert technologies, black projects, even the UFO phenomena, and something that we'll definitely get into, the inescapable correlations that has with consciousness studies as well? What drove you down these avenues originally?
Okay, well, I'm a retired firefighter paramedic from the city of Sacramento in the United States in California. I was instrumental through testimony and court proceedings and helping the fire departments obtain control of emergency transportation, and that was in the early 90s. After I retired, I stumbled upon a phenomenon that U.S. citizens were experiencing, and I met a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Hall, who's the author of 2 books. The first book was called A New Breed: Satellite Terrorism in America. And then the second book is Guinea Pigs, Technologies of Control, which he writes a chapter about my efforts in helping the community with this phenomenon. Now, when I met Dr. Hall, I met him in Austin, Texas at a conference that I was at, and we were talking about a topic that was happening, and that individuals were coming to him expressing complaints of unusual symptoms, mainly about hearing an unusual high-pitched frequency. And that was followed by brain fog, short-term, long-term memory losses, vertigo, nausea, vomiting, and electrical shocks to the extremity, sort of if you've ever touched a light socket and feel electrical vibration going through your body, this is what they were complaining about. Now, this year, the Department of Homeland Security here in the United States on May 8th held a hearing regarding what is called anomalous health incidences, or what is known as Havana syndrome. And in that hearing, a gentleman by the name of Colonel Greg Edgren, who is retired, gave testimony that this phenomenon is real and it is happening here in the homeland. And for those who don't know what the Havana syndrome is, it came about in 2016 when our diplomats were complaining of some unusual symptoms: acute onset of these strange sounds, short, long-term memory fog, these weird vibrations through their body, vertigo, nausea, vomiting, all the exact same symptoms that we were covering in 2009. Now, initially, the United States didn't give it much credence. They thought it was a psychosis phenomenon, a group hysteria phenomenon. They even blamed it on crickets at one point. And they didn't take it seriously until the Canadian diplomats started complaining of the same exact symptoms. So they conclude that in 2016, this phenomenon started. But it actually started in 2014 when diplomats were complaining about this and agents. Colonel Edgren testified that this is affecting the best of our best diplomats, our brightest minds in the CIA, our brightest minds in the FBI, and currently it is happening to some congressional members here in the United States. Now, Getting back to Dr. John Hall felt that because they're complaining of this frequency, and if this did exist, that we should be able to detect something around their person. And so he started doing on a sporadic basis what was called an RF scan. And they were coming up positive in certain cases. And so I asked him, I said, well, why isn't anything being done about it? And he says, back then, the theater was everyone was taught to go to their general practitioner. And if you went to your general practitioner, medicine today isn't free thinking anymore. You check boxes. And if you were to go in and complain about these symptoms, you would be diagnosed with some type of mental illness and then therefore placed on medication and being re-victimized again. So I said to Dr. Hall, why don't we create a way to take these subjective complaints and make them into objective data? And so with the help of a couple other gentlemen, we created an organization back then called the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies, and we'll call that ICE-ACT for short. And so I decided to call a meeting in Sacramento, California in late 2009, early 2010. And I just disseminated flyers into the community and said, hey, if you're having these symptoms, come talk to us. We'd like to see you at this meeting. So I figured maybe we'd have a handful of people. But 100 people showed up. It was standing room only. And they all had the exact same complaints with very, very little deviation. It was at that point that I realized that there was something more going on than meets the eye. So I decided to start doing radio frequency scanning around a person in the masses, just so that we could start getting data to see what kind of picture it painted. And so that year in Davis, California, I held a meeting advertising that we would be doing these RF scans, and 300 people showed up. And what the data was beginning to show is that the people who were most affected were Caucasian females in their 40s, highly educated, recently single, widowed, or divorced. Then it was Caucasian males, African American females, African American males, Asians, and it had dwindled down from there in ethnicity. Went to the Midwest of the United States. The same thing happened. Same results. Caucasians, African Americans, Asians, and it dwindled down. Until we got to Chicago. Chicago was a little bit different. The Caucasian criteria and the African American criteria switched, where the African Americans were primarily affected, then Caucasians, Asians, and dwindled down. And that remained consistent all the way to the East Coast, with one exception, and that was in Virginia. I was invited by a group of folks there. They were all military subcontractors who were experiencing these same symptoms. And they had heard about my work and asked me to come and do radio frequency scanning. And so I did that. And at that meeting, I was doing not only radio frequency scanning, but I was also testing for suggestibility. And in my introduction, I should have said that currently I am a certified master hypnotist with my diploma in hypnotherapy. And the reason I wanted to get that certification and diploma is because I noticed the phenomenon of the people that were most affected. The people who were most affected, and what I mean, we're talking doctors, lawyers, judges, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, but particularly the higher educated people, a lot of those people were losing million-dollar businesses. And what I noticed about them is that they were highly suggestible. And I'll bring the importance of that topic up here later on in our conversation. There are a couple cases here in the United States where two gentlemen contacted me. One of them was the name Aaron Alexis. He was a United States soldier. And he called me wanting help because he was experiencing these exact same symptoms. And there's another gentleman by the name of Myron May, who was an attorney out of Florida, who also contacted me and was complaining about these exact same symptoms. Now, when this phenomena happens to someone, there's two categories that happen. They're either in the fight response or you're in the flight response. The majority of people are in flight. but their personality makeups were not that they would do this. They were fighters. And unfortunately, and if I could have interceded in any way or even knew what they were capable or what they were planning on doing, I would have intervened. But Aaron Alexis ended up killing 16 people at the Navy Yard on the East Coast. And in the butt of his rifle, he wrote, "This is my ELF weapon, extremely low frequency," in the butt of the rifle. He was ultimately shot and killed there. And Myron May also did the same thing at the university in the research department. He killed 3 people, believing that they were responsible for what was happening to him. Now, Colonel Egren testified that this phenomenon is happening on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And what he stated is that they believe that there was a directed energy weapon being sent to these individuals, and this is why they were hearing the signal. And it was meant to harm them in a very covert way. So we took the approach, because they're saying that's only happening to federal employees and their family members. We knew that this phenomenon was happening since at least we were documenting since late 2009. Now, we said, well, think of the logistics. We have so many people who are complaining about this that the feasibility of hiring and logistical nightmare of hiring that many people to be pointing this weapon at this many people at one time doesn't make sense. So we said there's something that has to be unique about these individuals, because they can be in an environment in crowds and still being experiencing this. Then if this signal is being aimed, why aren't others hearing it? So we said there must be something unique internally with them that's allowing them to receive the signal. And because we were doing RF scans and they were coming up positive, in a very distinct pattern. So you had 3 categories. You had those who were complaining about these AHIs, anomalous health incidences, or Havana syndrome. You can superimpose their RF scans over each other, and they're all in identical places. Very focal and very specific. Then you had the military guys. You can put them over each other, and theirs were slightly different, but very focal, very specific. And then there was the incarcerated group, those who had been incarcerated in the past, and you can line them up, and they were very focal and very specific. And so it was intriguing. I then was invited overseas by a government agency to test some of their diplomats and their family members. And they allowed me to bring Americans and people from all over the world that I had tested to enter into what is called an Anachoic chamber at a research facility there in Europe. And we used controls, so people who did not have any symptoms whatsoever. And an anechoic chamber is an environment, it's millions of dollars, but it blocks out frequencies between 9 kilohertz and 18 gigahertz. So we already knew that the frequencies that we were detecting were well within that spectrum. So if our theory was right, if for whatever reason the human body was emitting these signals, then we should be able to prove this in that anechoic chamber. And what we did is we used the control groups. We tested them for frequency emissions, and the environment on our frequency readers read 0. And so we were very excited about that, because now we knew that we were in a controlled environment that was frequency free from the emissions that we were looking for. And so therefore, if indeed these individuals were emitting a signal, when we put those symptomatic patients in the environment, we should detect a signal. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we found. There were frequency emissions being emitted from those individuals who were complaining about these symptoms. So where are we at today? I'm going to share my screen here.
So that kind of suggests that it's not just like a continuous bombardment of energy, but something that actually seems to remain in the system, potentially altering the biofield?
Well, I'm about to show you. This is going to be a photomicrographic study of 3 specimens that were pulled out of one of my earliest clients, and she's a sweetheart of a woman. I have no idea why someone would want to do this to her. But this was done in 2018, and they surgically removed 3 specimens from her person. And what we did is we made sure that there was chain of custody on all the specimens that were removed, so that it was appropriate evidence, and no one can say that it was altered in any way. And you can see it's this foreign body specimens, material specimens, and then what they found is these were semiconductors with waveguides. They also had nanotech in them, and I'll show you exactly what they look like.
What year was this taken from her?
2018.
2018.
Yes. So this is the first specimen. This is actually a nanowire. Our bodies don't reject these biosensors, and so our tissues will engulf them. So there is no rejection of these. And these are very, very small. They're approaching nano size of these specimens here. And they come in various shapes and sizes. So this is what we've concluded, that we believe that this is the reason that they are receiving this signal that they hear. And just to show you the progression of this technology, this is the Larson case. This was a politician in Southern California, and this was in late 2009, and he had over 10 of these biosensors removed from his person. Now look at the size of these sensors. This is 2 letters on a penny. This is how small they were in late 2009. They were in various shapes and sizes. This one here is about the size of four letters on a penny. But this was taken out of Mr. Larson, and he sued, and it was thrown out of court. And the reason it was thrown out of court was because he inadvertently signed up to be in an experiment. And what these biosensors were doing were sending real-time data of his physiology. And so this is part of our fight, is to make sure that when someone enters into experiment, that they are given full disclosure, because if Mr. Larson had been given full disclosure, he would never have allowed them to do what they've done. To show you what they were in size, in the early 40s, 50s, and up into the early 90s, they used to be the size of a large grain of rice. This case here is the Bob Boyce case. Now, Bob Boyce was an inventor of a high-efficiency engine, and he, when I spoke to him, he had developed terminal cancer. And he said to me he just thought he was going to die from this cancer, and so that was going to be his life. Now, he was in what's called a Faraday cage, testing for RF leakage in his inventions. It's similar to the Anachoic chamber, but on a much smaller version. Now, what we see here is a cancerous tumor. At the end of these tweezers, you'll see an RFID chip. And what Bob was doing, utilizing a similar device like we do when we test for RF emissions, the one accidentally swiped by one of his shoulders and it pinged. And he thought that was odd, went and got an x-ray so they could see this microchip in the middle of the tumor. So he had surgery, and I said, well, Bob, what did pathology say about the chip? Where's the chip? And he says it disappeared. So I said, well, I'm not surprised. But he was just happy that after they removed this first chip, that his cancer went into remission. And so he was very happy about that. But nonetheless, a short time later, the cancer came back very aggressively. he went back into the Faraday cage, rescanned this person, and they found a second chip. This time they were smarter about it, and they used chain of custody, just like we do in our cases, and they removed that second chip. Now, they were able to trace through the digital serial number of this microchip, and this microchip went back to an NSA database. And that's where his case got stonewalled. Wow. They said that there was a national security issue, and therefore they would not share any further information with us. So that is where we're at today. We do have an unusual case that recently popped up. It's a special forces soldier who was having some bizarre symptoms. And a lot of times it's not uncommon for someone to say that they had a loss of time. And he expressed this, and then shortly thereafter started having some auditory symptoms. And so we decided, well, why don't we do an RF scan on you and let's see. And to our surprise, it did come up positive. So then we sent him to go get what's called a nonlinear junction scan. And in a moment here, we'll share what this process looks like with your audience so you can understand and visually see what this looks like. And when we sent him to have a nonlinear junction scan, we were surprised that he came up hot in 6 locations. But what's most unusual about his case is that there was a frequency that was detected we had not detected in the last 20 years that we've been doing this. And when we traced this signal, we expected it to be a frequency that was owned by the United States, and it wasn't. It was actually owned by NATO. And so we're like, well, what the heck does NATO, why would NATO have the license rights on this frequency, particularly coming from a U.S. Special Ops soldier?
How did you find out that this frequency was licensed to NATO?
So there are databases that you can type in the frequency spectrums, and they will tell you exactly who owns those frequency spectrums. Now, this is done globally. They have to, so that we don't have what's called crosstalk or interference between one country versus the other. So that was very unique, and we're keeping a close eye on this because we do know of another person out there who also has a case of a special ops person who is coming up with this exact same frequency. So that's something to be determined in what we're looking for.
Can you say what the frequency is?
I don't want to because it could compromise these soldiers. But I'm going to show you in that video. If you could click on that link for the video, that was just the second one that I sent you. We're going to hear Colonel Egrin being introduced in the Department of Homeland Security, and then we'll move into what this radio frequency scan looks like.
Mr. Chairman, ranking members, congressmen, it is an honor to speak with you today and give voice to the unseen, the U.S. government, AHI survivors, and their families. My name is Greg Edgreen. I stood up and led the DIA's task force, which was in charge of taking care of our survivors and determining the cause. For background, I'm not an analyst. I'm a retired Army and intelligence officer. The following are my personal opinions and do not represent the opinions of the government. Given the classification of this topic, many of my comments will have to be made at a future closed-door session. As a country, we have been here before. Most people think this all started in Havana in 2016, the widely reported Havana syndrome. This led to the U.S. withdrawing most of its staff and ending rapprochement between Havana and Washington. But before Havana syndrome, there was the Moscow signal. Soviet intelligence bathed the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwave transmissions. The health effects were similar to what we see today. There are many examples of syndromes and ailments from Americans injured in the line of duty that the government did not recognize for many years, which were eventually proven. Agent Orange used in Vietnam, the Gulf War syndrome, burn pits during the forever wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. In all of these examples, America took too long to acknowledge these injuries, and our service members languished without care. Havana syndrome is no different. The gaslighting of AHI survivors continues to this day as history repeats itself. Throughout all this, I learned America's best men and women in national security are being targeted and neutralized in a global campaign. AHIs have been reported in the press in every continent except for Antarctica, with a large percentage of these attacks occurring in the homeland, in American, in this town. The impact has been that mission-critical government officials working abroad and at home are being removed from their post with TBIs.
So we're going to see this is how our frequency scanning is done. We'll do this in the field with the JM20 Pro. So this is a licensed medical professional. I won't disclose what she does, but she's very well respected in the community. And I have it sped up until we get to our first positive location. And what's unique about this device, it'll allow us to attenuate it down. So if any outside frequencies are coming in, we have to be within 2 inches of an emission.
That you and a match could do. So I want you to lean to your right just a little bit. Up toward. Lean to your right. Up toward me. Step away. Up towards me.
So this is in the TMJ, the temporomandibular joint right here. And we'll tag it so we can come back later with a frequency reader, and it will give us a numeric frequency that it detects around that region.
Right then.
And same thing, much lean to your right. Come towards me. To your right. Come towards me.
And interestingly enough, these are very common locations, and that we do get, for whatever reason, positive preliminary results in the field. Okay, so now I'm going to have you move it to 643, just so you can see how devastating this is emotionally for these individuals.
That right there, man.
And the wand is extended because each length will detect a certain frequency band.
Lean to your left. Come towards me. To your left. Come towards me.
So is it the top of the shoulder or the upper arm, do you ask?
I'm trying to figure it out. Say R. Lean to your left. Come towards me.
Again, we'll tag that just so we know exactly where to come back and use the frequency reader. So these people are constantly being told that they're crazy, they've got a mental illness. And Colonel Egren testified that that's the purpose. This is meant to make a person feel like they're crazy. And he calls it a long duration slow kill. This is probably one of the strongest readings I've ever had in a preliminary scan on anyone.
Come in closer on. So you can get.
Well, I zoned in.
I want you to show me for a second. So this is a frequency counter. See that bar graph? That tells you the level or how strong that signal is. So
100 being enough.
well, you see this bar graph? Okay. I have not come across it being that strong on most of my scans. Usually it will seem like 2 or 3. So whatever is happening, we're running it to take a closer look at to this region here, not right at all. But let's record this.
Hold on.
Yeah, and that graph there is just pinging off the scale. In a controlled environment, which is called an anechoic chamber, which blocks out frequencies between 9 kilohertz and 18 gigahertz. We use control subjects. That means someone who is not complaining of any symptoms. And then we use those who have come up positive in our preliminary RF scan. Notice how the control subject tests 0 for frequency emissions, while the symptomatic subject will come up positive for frequency emissions within the shielded environment. So this is someone from the embassy there in Europe. So notice that it says 0. This is when we knew that we were in the right environment. This is actually a government official who's non-symptomatic that we were testing inside the environment. And again, as long as that light is flashing, it's scanning for signals, and we get 0. So we have the control person and a symptomatic person in the environment, which we're about to test.
Okay.
So the light's flashing and scanning for signals, and lo and behold,
Yes.
we're detecting them. Okay. And now we're going to switch places with those two because we're going to use the control again. And if our readings are correct, we should get 0.
Your assessments here are correct. These are very covert weapons, aren't they? They don't leave behind bomb fragments, bullet holes, etc. They could absolutely be used by our adversaries and have very low levels of, very easy to deny that they were even there, that they were used. Is that correct?
That's correct. There's no entry or exit wound. How they're designed is to make the target feel like they're crazy, like they're imagining things, especially on the low duration, the low intensity, long duration hits.
Disturbing. Before I get to my questions, I just want to reiterate that we're going to do everything we can to assure that the victims, those that are suffering, will receive consistent health care for what is ailing you. But, Mr. Edwin, the evidence, no intentional attack, yet what I'm hearing from Mr. Zaid, Mr. Grozov, is that there's a possibility that something is out there attacking us, especially in Homeland. Mr. Edwin, based on what Mr. Zaid just said, what are your thoughts
My personal thoughts
as an intelligence officer?
is that I agree with them. My personal opinions is that this is a global campaign and it includes attacking us here at home. It is a strategic issue that is going to impact us.
Is this a attack by the Russians, just the Russians, and is it against the U.S. solely or other allies as well?
I have to be careful what I say here. So let me say this.
And if I can, say what you can. If you gentlemen feel better talking about this in a more secure setting,
I'll start by
we can
saying
work
this.
on that as well.
Congressman, thank you for the question. Give me 20 minutes in a skiff and I'll convince all of you. I know where the bodies are buried. I know the cabinets to look in, the questions to ask, and the people to subpoena.
You said that you managed to draw a correlation to at least the National Security Agency, which kind of suggests almost some sort of bio surveillance, but then you've got negative effects. So there's some sort of aggressive motive as well. So what do you think here?
So what we are finding is a lot of these sensors that are being pulled out of people all go back to a biomedical company. Now, I'm about to disclose the smoking guns, where there's no denying that at least certain government agencies are implementing this. I'm going to share with the audience and yourself a declassified document called New World Vistas. It was released in November of 1994 by the United States Air Force. unfortunately, we need to wake people up because the first line of defense is knowledge. So this is the document that I'm going to share. This was obtained in 1995, the FOIA request. And this is the Defense Technical Information Center. Basically, it's titled New World Vistas, Air and Space Power for the 21st Century. This is actually a 222-page document, but I made it short just to get to the area called biological processes that are in this disclosed report. And I'm going to read the highlighted areas, and then I'll lead you into the smoking gun that we've obtained. Now, again, this is on page 89 of the report. I've left a link for you and your audiences. All the information that we're discussing here is there and then some. I encourage you to really educate yourself and go through the documentation so you can just become aware of where we're at today. And this is biological process controls, and I'm going to read the highlighted areas. And it says, it appears likely that there are a number of physical agents that might actively but largely benignly interact or interfere with biological processes in an adversary in a manner that will provide our armed forces the tools to control these adversaries without extensive loss of life or property. These physical agents could include acoustic fields, optical fields, electromagnetic fields, and combinations thereof. This paper will address only the prospect of physical regulation of biological processes using electromagnetic fields. Prior to the mid-21st century, there will be a virtual explosion of knowledge in the field of neuroscience. We will have achieved a clear understanding of how the human brain works, how it really controls the various functions of the body, and how it can be manipulated both positively and negatively. One can envision the development of electromagnetic energy sources, the output of which can be pulsed, shaped, and focused, that can couple with the human body in a fashion that will allow one to prevent voluntary muscular movements, control emotions and thus actions, produce sleep, transmit suggestions, interfere with both short-term and long-term memory, produce an experience set, and delete an experience set. Pay close attention to that. This will open the door for the development of some novel capabilities that can be used in armed conflict, in terrorist hostage situations, and in training. New weapons that offer the opportunity of control of an adversary without reporting to a lethal solution or collateral casualties can be developed around this concept. This would offer significant improvements in the capabilities of our special operation forces. Initial experimentation should be focused on interaction of electromagnetic energy and the neuromuscular junctions involved in voluntary muscle control. Now, it's quite interesting that the diplomats are all complaining about those exact same symptoms. It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction.
We talk
When a hot
voice-to-skull technology.
Correct. When a high-power microwave pulse in gigahertz range strikes the human body, a very small temperature perturbation occurs. This is associated with a sudden expansion of the slightly heated tissues. This expansion is fast enough to produce an acoustic wave. If a pulse stream is used, it should be possible to create an internal acoustic field in the 5 to 15 kilohertz range, which is audible. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them. In comparison to the discussion in the paragraphs above, the concept of imprinting an experience set is highly speculative, but nonetheless highly exciting. Modern electromagnetic scattering theories raises the prospect that ultra-short pulse scattering through the human brain can result in reflected signals that can be used to construct a reliable estimate of degree of central nervous system arousal. The concept behind a remote EEG is to scatter off action potentials or ensembles of action potentials in major central nervous system tracts. Assuming we will understand how our skills are imprinted and recalled, it might be possible to take this concept one step further and duplicate the experience set in another individual. So what are they exactly saying here? This sounds pretty sci-fi, but we have a case that was filed in Southern California in 2019, and it's called the Don DeVore case. And Don DeVore,
When was that document written, by the way, the one that you just went through?
that one was released in 1994, November. So that was the United States Air Force brightest minds being put together to do this report. Now it's a 222-page report. So they had to be working on it. That was 30 years ago. So they had to be working on it even further before that. This is the smoking gun that we've been waiting for. And John DeVore was an RN for the Department of Corrections in California. And she became a whistleblower and became part of this program. Interestingly enough, Don DeVore had extracted implants just like my client did. They were very, very similar in structure and type. Now, Don DeVore, unfortunately for her, this was done to her, but fortunately for the community, she intercepted some evidence, and this was submitted as Exhibit 2. And this was a document that was only meant for high-level management in the Department of Corrections. And it's entitled IntelliConnection, a security division of IBM. Confidential, limited distribution only, level 9 communication. And it's titled 2020 Neurochip Implant. And it says the control of crime will be a paramount concern in the 21st century. We must be ready with our security products when the demand for them becomes popular. Our Research and Development Division has been in contact with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the California Department of Corrections, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the Massachusetts Department of Corrections to run limited trials of the 2020 Neurochip implant. We have established representatives of our interest in both management and institutional levels within these departments. Federal regulations do not yet permit testing of implants on prisoners, but we have entered into contractual agreements with privatized healthcare professionals and specified correctional personnel to do limited testing of our products. We have also had major success in privately owned sanitariums with implant technology. Think about the most vulnerable in our society. We need, however, to expand our testing to research how effective the 2020 Neurochip implant performs in those identified as the most aggressive in our society. Limited testing has produced a number of results. In California, several prisoners were identified as members of a security threat group. They were brought to the Health Services Department in Pelican Bay and tranquilized with advanced sedatives developed by our Cambridge, Massachusetts laboratories. The implant procedure takes 60 to 90 minutes depending upon the experience of the technician. We are working on a device which will reduce the time by as much as 60%. The results of the implants on 8 prisoners yielded the following results. The implants served as surveillance monitoring devices in the threat group. Now, that's important because they can see and hear everything in the environment if this is done to you. Implants disabled 2 subjects during an assault on correctional staff. All they had to do was send a frequency to the chips, and it incapacitated them. Universal side effects in all 8 test subjects revealed that when implants were sent 116 megahertz signal, all subjects became lethargic and slept on an average of 18 to 22 hours per day. All subjects refused recreation periods. Obviously, if you're lethargic, you're not going to do that. You're also going to refuse exercise. Each subject was monitored for aggressive activity during the test period, and the findings are conclusive that out of the 8 test subjects exhibited no aggression even when provoked. Each subject experienced only minor bleeding from the nose and ears 48 hours after the implant due to initial adjustment. Each subject had no knowledge of the implant for the test period, and each implant was retrieved under the guise of medical treatment. Now, this is a clear violation of the Nuremberg Code. Any experimentation done on a human being is supposed to be given full disclosure. It should be noted that the test period was for less than 2 months. However, during the period, substantial data was gathered by our research and development team, which suggests that the implants exceeded expected results. One of the major concerns of the security and research and development team was that the test subjects would discover the chemical imbalance during the initial adjustment period, and the test would have to be scrubbed. However, due to the advanced technological developments in the sedatives administered, the 48-hour adjustment period can be attributed to prescription medication given to the test subjects after the implant procedure. So instead of saying the truth, which is your bodies are fighting these foreign objects that are put in you, they're going to blame it on the drugs. One of the concerns raised by the research and development was the cause of the bleeding and how to eliminate the problem. Unexplained bleeding might cause a subject to inquire further about his routine visit to the infirmary or other health care facility. The security windfall from the brief test period was enormous. Security officials now know several strategies employed by this threat group that facilitate the transmission of illegal drugs and weapons into their correctional facilities. One intelligence officer remarked that while they cannot use this information in a court of law, now they know who to watch outside, connections they have. The prison at Soledad is now considering transferring 3 subjects to Vacaville prison. This is where the majority of this chip implant research is going on, where we have ongoing implant research. Our technicians have promised that they can do 3 2020 neurochip implants in less than an hour. Soledad officials hope to collect information from the trio to bring a 14-month investigation into drug trafficking by correctional officers to a close. Essentially, the implants make the unsurprising prisoner a walking, talking recorder of every event he comes into contact with. There are only 5 intelligence officers in the Commissioner of Corrections who actually know the full scope of the implant testing. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I think your audience gets it.
So this is a document that comes from IBM, from a legal case via discovery.
Correct.
And that's essentially almost like a special access program section of IBM doing some very clandestine level of operation. And are they contracted? Are they being contracted by an agency or?
Well, this is a subsidiary of IBM. Now, these tech companies don't just get free access. Most of these are subcontracted through the government, a government agency of some sort. And if you think back during the concentration camps, who came up with the punch card system for the Jews who were being incarcerated? Do you know what company that was?
IBM.
It was IBM. They're still at it. They're still doing it. And unfortunately, that's where we're at. Now, let's talk a little bit about the history of where we've come today. So the United States government funded a Canadian psychiatrist by the name of Ewan Cameron way back in the day. And the funding was given to him so he can experiment on whether or not you can erase a human brain, an adult human brain, and re-imprint it with new memories, false memories. And what he would do is he would use electrical shock therapy, drug therapy to induce long-term sleep. He would put a helmet over their heads with a tape recorder in it. And the tape recorder would just loop over concepts and themes to these people while they were in their sleep. Today, you've just read, you've seen all the documentation. This is what was defined as psychic driving back in Ewan Cameron's days. This is psychic driving on steroids. So if this is done to someone who is unknowing and unwittingly, even has the concept that this type of technology exists, you can influence the right personality type to do almost anything that they would not normally do, and they cannot remember it if you have the right personality type. So this is why we seek out to at least, everyone needs help. There are no resources currently for the civilian population. And as Colonel Egren said, this is happening on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. There are no resources for the civilian population right now, no healthcare. They automatically get checkbox and put into the mental health industry. And this is why we're out here disseminating this information, because the first line of defense is knowing and being in touch with your internal voice. your internal compass, your moral aptitudes. That is the first line of defense in order to, if this happens to you, unfortunately, in order to safeguard yourself.
See, I can understand this being like a weapon system for people being, deployed strategically against ambassadors. But why the average public? Is it just the fact that this is a very covert effort? They can get away with it, so they might as well just experiment on the average citizen, because who's gonna catch them? Or is there something else? I mean, what do you think the motives for kind of like random population selection are?
Okay. So what we feel strongly is that in 2009, 2010, all the way to 15, 16, that was the experimental phase. I think right now we're in a arms race. President Putin did an article in the Politico, and he said the first superpower to master psychotronic weapons will be the superpower to rule the world. So who has this technology? We know the United States does. We know that Russia does. We know the UK does, and we know that China does. And we also believe that India does. And so what a beautiful construct if you're trying to divide and conquer, create political turmoil and unrest around the world. This would be a way to do it. In addition, if you wanted to take those who are most controllable and weed out those who are not controllable, this would be a way to do it. So this is why I feel strongly, at least at this point, we're probably in an arms race. Otherwise, we wouldn't be taking out our CIA agents, our best of the best. Yeah.
It's interesting that you said that the level of susceptibility is kind of dependent on the level of suggestibility. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I mean, to be honest, there are lots of examples of wide-scale collective behavior being changed very, easily through fear and through certain catalysts. So what is it about suggestibility and directed energy weapons that seems to allow people to be worse affected?
So you remember, this transmits sound subconsciously. And when it comes to who is really in control as a human, it's your subconscious that is in control. It's the part of you that, is responsible for every breath that you take, every beat of your heart, your blink responses. And it takes in information without criticism. And so if you have someone who's highly suggestible, and you're able to transmit subliminal messages to them, particularly in their sleep or when they're in a certain phase, you can direct commands, and including create false memories, experience sets that they, no matter what you say to them, even though they didn't experience it, if you embed it in their subconscious, they're going to believe it. They're going to feel it as if they were there yesterday. You can elicit any of these types of responses. So that's one aspect of it. But the suggestibility is really on how we interpret and intake information, and that is derived on our upbringing. Whether you had a very strict mother, a very affectionate mother, very strict father, very affectionate father, there's all kinds of dynamics, whether there's childhood trauma, whether you were in an abusive environment, all these things will affect your suggestibility. Now, 30% of the population, up to 30% of the population, through statistics and studies, are naturally highly suggestible. And so if you, unfortunately, are one of those individuals who are highly suggestible, through no fault of your own, then if this is done to you, you can be affected in a very, very, very detrimental way.
Yeah, this is a very concerning subject. It's something that I know kind of on a cursory basis. I'm familiar with certain players. Are you familiar with someone named Colonel John Alexander?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, because he had a role in the psychotronic space, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Yes. He did a lot of studies. I know he was involved in SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. I'm forgetting the gentleman's name who headed that His name is skipping me right now.
How off?
Yes, Puthoff and that group. So this all comes into play because in our experience in our research over the last 2 decades, for some reason, and I've spoken to high up officials in 3-letter agencies and who have contacted me because of my work, and I was rather surprised because I'm really nobody. I'm just a firefighter paramedic. I have a certain skill set, and but they were intrigued by the fact that we were pulling out implants, and that was the only reason they reached out to speak to me, because they wanted to know how much I knew. And the only reason I was concerned is because I had heard that a lot of the federal employees are still they weren't sure what was affecting them. And I just wanted to disseminate the information. Look, if you haven't looked at this aspect of it, because it's outside the scope of medicine, that you might want to take a look at it. And that's all I was doing, it to at least extend a different perspective and a bit different possibility on how to get them help.
Are you familiar with psychoacoustics or psychoacoustic architecture?
On the cuspid, I am somewhat familiar with it. Really, what it all boils down to, it's still about knowing what personality types, know how to induce trance, and know when the human mind is most susceptible to subliminal information.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because I honestly think this is a coveted science, because psychoacoustics is kind of the study of how acoustics can influence your psychology, right? So the binaural tones, brainwave entrainment, different harmonics affecting brainwave states. What they've been discovering, and something that I've been digging into quite a lot recently, is that these ancient sites, these ancient sacred sites all over the world, are purposefully geometrically engineered to actually resonate very specific harmonic tones, standing wave patterns, and all of these kind of novel harmonic frequencies, which they have then discovered, especially infrasound and these kind of below the threshold of human hearing audio waves, are altering consciousness, changing the brainwave state. And this is something that the deeper you dig, you start realizing that it all ties into, you know, the disregarded sides of mysticism, the Gnostic Bible, the stuff that was thrown away by the Catholic Church. This is something that over centuries was kind of just suppressed and removed from the world. And so our acoustic sciences, we're only just getting to the point where we're going, oh, these infrasounds, they change frequencies in consciousness. That's interesting. And then we find out that Chavin de Huanta in Peru or the Great Pyramid of Giza are doing the same thing. So this is why I think that this is actually something that, you know, when you're tapping into these psychoacoustic potentials for weaponry and the classified study of acoustic sciences, I think this goes very deep. I think it goes very deep and back into history and the suppression of certain sciences through time.
Yeah, the word suppression is a really good way of defining it. And what is happening, it's been suppressed on purpose, so that the majority of people don't become free thinkers, don't raise their vibration, don't become enlightened. But I think there's no way to stop it now. I like to think that, you know, there is a higher power, and that ultimately, even though we have some nefarious individuals who are in positions of power, who are implementing these programs, that ultimately the master programmer, whether it be God, Buddha, whoever that may be for you, in the end, is still going to outsmart them.
I completely agree. And also, I suppose, in a way, depending again on your you know, theological model, if you have one or entertain one, it's all part of the experience, right? If we had solved all of the problems, we would be in the place that we dream that might be beyond this life. But the fact of the matter is, the human experience is full of black, white, yin, yang, up, down, hot, cold. So there's a dynamic at play, and it's part of the game to have the baddies and the goodies and people in between, and everyone's just playing a role. So I try and look at it in that perspective when things get a bit intense, because we're in a very intense time right now in the world. And I know as a young man, just looking at the way things are happening on the geopolitical stage in Ukraine and Russia and the Middle East, it's a time where it's very easy to just let the anxiety and fear wash over you. But I would invite people to try and just keep their own counsel, and also remember that the wider information landscape is one that has to be traversed very carefully in terms of what's true and what's not.
Yeah, and you bring up an important perspective. Everything is by design right now, keeping you afraid, keeping your anxiety at a high level, keeping you not knowing what's going to happen around the corner. This is all by design. And once they put you in, and this is an altered state, it makes you more suggestible than you would naturally be at your normal, calm, relaxed state. And so when you do that to a huge population, and then you put on the advent, let's just forget about this technology, but you talk about social media, you talk about television, you talk about any media dissemination out there. It's all by design, and it only amplifies the effect. And so the thing is I encourage people, even if you're not suffering from this anomaly, that, good habits of good mental health and habits of keeping your autonomy are very important. So meditation is very important. Eating right, a healthy lifestyle, all these things come into play to make you less vulnerable. And just remember, we are human beings. We transition in and out of altered states all the time. And the problem is, they've had years. I have released documentation that they were doing this in the 70s, again in Vacaville prison. For whatever reason, well, I know why it's done. You look at our mental health system. Once you're diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis, you are not credible anymore.
No.
And so you're even more susceptible to be experimented on, because no one's going to believe you. They're just going to think you're crazy. Our addicted personalities, those who have substance abuse issues, they are experimented on. And then our incarcerated people, they are being experimented on non-consensually. And so these, in my book, these are animals. These aren't humans. You don't do this to other human beings. You just don't.
No, it's something like a dystopian film. I mean, it's something that we've all come to terms with in that type of environment. The idea of a shady corporate government quasi, organization using people at the lowest threshold of society to do god-awful experimentations on. But that document that you presented is quite alarming and eye-opening. I'd be interested to know who's seen that document, because like I said, this isn't my particular field of diving in. I've kind of skirted around the edges. I was not aware of that documentation, and that's pretty damning. Damning. And is there anything else on IBM other than that, or is that the only little kind of glint of?
That's the only glimpse. But who's doing this? We know DARPA's experimenting on this. We know BlackRock Neuro's experimenting. Everyone's in a race to master this.
Elon Musk is obviously being very open with it. So what do you think about Neuralink?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fascinating concept to get people who have lost their ability to communicate and being able to do that.
There are pros to this as well, obviously, but
yeah, but the issue is that unfortunately humans have proven over time and time again they can't be responsible with great power, and disseminating this technology in a fair and unharmful way, because it could really benefit society. Think about this. If you can have some type of tech in you where you just download information and all of a sudden you're an expert at it, or make you superhuman through strength, endurance, being able to self-heal. All of these aspects could be utilized in a very, very beneficial way, but is being abused, unfortunately, by people who just want to retain power. and control over what they are now treating us like are animals. Well, actually, even animals have more rights than us these days, it seems like.
So I guess the issue is that it's not going anywhere. Obviously, these people are still doing what they're doing. It's going to keep developing. There'll be white hats and black hats and gray hats. So what do you see as the outcome for us? Because this is fast-paced, accelerating technology, especially with AI coming down. You know, all of these things are getting a boost in terms of their ability to accelerate these innovations. So short, mid, long term, where do you see humanity going?
Well, that's what our fight is right now, is because there is a fight right now to maintain what we are defined as humans. I did a interview, it's called the Celestial Report, and she's an investigative scientific journalist and one of the most brilliant minds I met in a while. And when I conveyed all of this evidence to her, she had shared something with me. She said that back in the late 90s, early 2000s, that the definition of what is human was redefined in the rule of law. And I was wondering why. You know that this technology is now approaching, it is nano size. They do have the ability, and in that link, all the research documentation is there, that they have created these things called nanobarrels. And in these nanobarrels, you can put whatever you want inside of them. And through radio frequencies, you can manipulate and direct this nanotech to go wherever you want in the body, including crossing the blood-brain barrier. And if they send a certain frequency, it will explode and open up and release what's in it. The problem with this nanotech is that no MRI, no X-ray, no medical imagery or testing is going to be, as far as visualization, you're going to be able to see it. The only way you're going to be able to see this is to put it under a microscope. Now, there was a recent study done with the lidocaine derivative. How many times do you go to the dentist? And when they put it on a slide and they looked under the microscope, you can see the nanotech evenly dispersed through it in the fluid medium. When you expose it to an RF frequency or an EMF frequency, it aligned and self-replicated into what is called an array, a square microchip array. So not only are these self-assembling, self-replicating, they can attach to your DNA, and that's where we're at now. So this is why it's important. What she was sharing with me is the agenda was to change our species to where we are no longer human. Then we are patentable. Then we can be owned by a corporation or be owned by a specific government agency who is in power. And that's what we're facing. And this is why it's important. If we're going to maintain our humanity as we are, it's important that everyone wakes up and everyone understands that this is real. This is not tinfoil hat make-believe. We now have the evidence. You can't deny it. It's not a conspiracy theory anymore. We're dealing with something that is real and tangible.